My name is Missy Sikora. I am the director of the Yavapai Family Advocacy Center. The Advocacy Center is a project of Prevent Child Abuse Arizona. And Prevent Child Abuse Arizona is a statewide organization dedicated to strengthening families and protecting children. So today, what we're here to talk about is mandated reporting. And hopefully by the end of this training, everybody watching it will have learned some skills and understanding of what a mandated reporter is, what your duties are as a mandated reporter, and how better to make that report. Our objectives for the training today are to identify the signs of child abuse, to recognize who and in what positions are people who are mandated reporters, and then what types of things should you report? What needs to be reported, and what is something that perhaps maybe there's some other interventions that you could do before reporting. And then lastly, how do you make that report? So when a report is necessary, who do you need to call? When do you need to call that agency? And I also want to talk a little bit with you about what happens after a report is made. I was a school teacher for 15 years and had to make reports. And I know that was something that was always really heavy on my heart. What happened to these kiddos once my report was made? Sometimes I would go and never know what happened and never know if anything was acted upon. So I want to make sure that we have some understanding around that as well. And then what other ways can we help? What I like to talk about is support before report, if that's at all possible, and sometimes doing both, supporting and reporting, if that's what is necessary for the situation. I want to make sure everybody knows that this topic can be triggering. We're going to talk about trauma that's happening to children. So if this is something that brings up those feelings in you, if this is something that you've experienced before, or someone that you love or care about is going through this or has gone through this, and it brings up some of those uneasy feelings for you, just please feel free to take a break from the training and come back to it a later time, or skip the part that's really upsetting. When we make reports, the law categorizes everything under two areas. It's either abuse or neglect. We'll get into the statute a little bit later in this training. When you're making a report, the agencies that you will report to, which would either be a law enforcement agency or the Department of Child Safety, it's going to fall under one of these two categories, either abuse or neglect. If it's categorized as abuse, they have three subcategories they're going to be looking at and trying to fit your information into one of these boxes. That could be either emotional abuse, physical abuse, or sexual abuse. And then really everything else that's a concern, any other concern that you have about a child and their well-being and safety in a family, falls under that neglect category. So we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about each of these areas and the signs that you might see that would be an indicator that something's going on in one of these areas. Emotional abuse, first off, is the most difficult to prove. According to Arizona State Statute 8201, there needs to be a psychologist or a medical professional who's going to document that there is serious emotional injury. They're going to need to see physical signs. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but really to prove that in a court, whether that be in a court where custody is being taken from a parent or a guardian, or whether that be criminal charges, we can't allege emotional abuse unless we have the supporting documentation behind it. But I think we all know, as people that work with kids, there is a component and an element of emotional abuse in really all of these situations. If a child is being harmed or hurt by their protector, their caregiver, their parent, there's an emotional component with that. The person that's supposed to protect me is now physically harming me. So there's an emotional component that's involved in that for children, and we do treat that once these come to the attention of the system, but we just can't prove that emotional abuse piece unless we have that other documentation. Signs that you might see or that you want to watch for in children where you feel like this could be something that's going on to a level where it's very concerning and intervention needs to happen to some degree would be inappropriate or delayed emotional development, kids that are inappropriately seeking affection. So I think that if you've worked with kids for any amount of time, you've met that 3 or 4-year-old who's climbing in your lap after the first 10 seconds of meeting you, telling you they love you, they want to go home with you, you're their best friend, you know, things like that. We know from child development experts, that that's not typical. Typically at that age, those children are still needing that attachment and connection to their protector, to their caregiver. They're seeking out contact and interactions with other people, but they still have that lifeline, that security net. So that might be something you want to watch for. And then a big red flag is loss of previously acquired developmental skills. So if you're a school teacher, that's where you see a kid goes home for the summer. Again, I taught school for a long time. So when they come back at the beginning of the year, you know there's some regression. You've got a second grader that came from first grade. They had all these social skills. They come back to school. There's regression. They've spent a summer kind of just not really remembering all those habits and all those social politenesses that we are all taught when we're growing up. But they're going to recoup that really quickly. Within a few weeks, you're kind of watching them recoup that and then go from there and grow. What we're talking about, what could be a sign of emotional abuse, is kids that have that regression and then they're not recouping it. So you're seeing a change in behavior in a child. And typically that could be a sign that maybe there had been some sort of trauma, something stepped in and kind of stunted their emotional development or growth. Physical abuse, so this is our second category of abuse, is mistreatment of a child that results in harm or injury to the child. And non-accidental is pretty self-explanatory. So did somebody intend to harm or cause injury to that child? But accidental things sometimes would need to be reported as well. And that's when a parent or a caregiver behaves recklessly, carelessly, maybe didn't intend for the child to get hurt or harmed, but because of their carelessness and their poor decision making, a child was put in danger and then ultimately seriously injured because of that decision on that caregiver's part. And so that's something that could possibly need to be reported, particularly if it's an adult who regularly makes those kind of rash decisions and attention-seeking, adrenaline-seeking decisions, and they're having their children involved in those activities that then put that child in danger. Things that you might look for and see with physical abuse are frequent and unexplained injuries to a child, bruises, fractures, burns, things on their face, things that don't match the explanation that they're giving you. So if a child, for instance, comes in and has bruises on their cheek that would match fingerprints, but they're telling you they fell off their bike, that would be a sign that possibly there's some injury. Those don't match. That's not going together. So there might be more going on, and this might be a story that they've decided they need to tell to protect the people in their home, or somebody's told them to tell. Injuries that appear to have a pattern, and you don't necessarily need to know what that pattern is. Not all bruises are going to come up with this straight 2 lines, red in the middle, that somebody was spanked with a belt. I have seen a lot of injuries that there's a pattern, but we're not exactly sure what the pattern is about. But because it's, say, circular bruises that are exactly 1 inch apart and they go in a straight line for the entire length of the child's back or leg or whatever, we know that some sort of instrument was used to cause that injury. A child wouldn't fall off the bike and get 6 bruises that are identical in shape and size and identical in distance from each other, but yet it happened from a fall. So that's where we want to kind of look at that. I have had children have a bruise. At one point, a young child was reported with a bruise to his face. We investigated. He reported that that happened from a fall off of his bike. This was at a school, and so he told his teacher that happened from a fall off of a bike. She thought that kind of matched. It could have happened. Maybe something hit his face. He didn't catch himself with his hands. So that was okay. Well, 3 days later, that child had a second bruise to his arm, his upper shoulder, a brand new bruise. And he said it had happened from the same bike fall. And he was walking with his dad. They were going to a certain place, and he fell off his bike in front of this building, this business. But those bruises were 3 days apart. So that doesn't make sense. How did one bruise pop up 3 days after the fact? So that was something that needed to be reported. And then kids that wear clothing that might be inappropriate for the weather, but it's obvious they're trying to cover up some type of injury or something. And kids that might flinch or move away from you suddenly. And again, these aren't always definite signs, but these are things that you would want to watch for that could be an indicator that something might be going on physically. Sexual abuse is the exploitation of a child or an adolescent for the gratification of another person. And this can be touching and non-touching. So nationally, statistics around this have stayed pretty stable for at least the last decade or so. And what we know is about 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys have been sexually abused to some extent by the time they turn the age of 18. And we'll go through what sexual abuse looks like in a little bit more detail right now. Examples of sexual abuse that would be physical contact or touching would be any type of fondling of the child or having a child fondle or touch an adult's sexual organs. And again, we're going back to that for sexual gratification of another person, right? Penetrating a child's vaginal area or anus, no matter how slight, whether that be with a penis, an object, a finger, anything like that. If it's not for a medical purpose and it's for sexual gratification of the adult or of the other person doing it, whether that person, I should say, is another child or an adult, that's sexual abuse. And of course, any type of oral sexual contact is also considered sexual abuse. Examples of non-touching is indecent exposure, exhibitionism around a child, exposing kids to pornography, whether that be movies or pictures, deliberately exposing kids to the act of sexual intercourse. A lot of people sometimes, particularly who have financial constraints in their family, they may co-sleep. They might have to share a room and share a bed with their children. But it's not okay to expose kids to two adults having sex in that way. And that could be actually considered sexual abuse. And then masturbating in front of a child. And with much of these non-touching things, what we see people use these as are grooming techniques to kind of desensitize children or young people to these kinds of things. So if a person is kind of building up where they're going to have that sexual contact with a child and that's what their end result or end goal is, they may do a lot of this stuff first. So then the kid is used to seeing them. They're naked. They change in the room with the door open and they're naked in front of the child and the child's seen them a dozen times. Maybe they're walking in on the child who's in the bathroom and saying it's accidental, but it's actually purposeful. So they can desensitize that child to this type of contact between them and the child. And then many times it evolves into the physical contact. So a lot of times here at the Advocacy Center, we don't get the reports until it's turned physical. But then when we interview the child and we talk to them about prior contact with that person who had been the perpetrator, we hear stories about how these other things had happened before the touching actually happened. Things that you might see is inappropriate knowledge regarding any type of sexual act by a child. So kids who know more than they should beyond their developmental age and what's appropriate for them. Inappropriate sexual contact with other children. So they're trying to kind of reenact or redo what's been done to them. Or of course, any type of pregnancy or STD in a young child. That's definitely a red flag and a sign that there's some inappropriate sexual contact or sexual abuse happening. And kids that don't want to change their clothes in front of others, particularly if that's something that had not been an issue for them before, or at their developmental stage, that's not a big deal. So an 8-year-old normally is going to change their clothes. They're not as shy typically, or around, say, their aunt or uncle, people they're comfortable with, but all of a sudden now they are. 13, 14-year-olds are usually shy and embarrassed around everybody. So you have to kind of take all of that into account. Another form of sexual abuse is sexual exploitation, and that's engaging or soliciting a child for the purpose of prostitution, which we call human trafficking. And then, of course, a piece of that would also be using that child to film any type of pornographic materials, movies, pictures, anything like that, taking those types of pictures of kids, even when they don't know the picture's being taken, and then using those for gratification for that adult sexually, or if they're sharing that material with other adults that are going to use it for that same reason. That's what we would consider human trafficking of a child. So the other category that we're going to talk about is neglect, and that's where everything else is going to fall under that's not under the abuse category. And that's the chronic failure. And again, I want to emphasize chronic failure to provide a child with adequate food, clothing, medical care, shelter, supervision, or support. Almost all of the reports that go to the Department of Child Safety Hotline fall under this neglect category. And so we're going to talk about that and what those things might look like. Here's types of neglect, and these are really the big standard ones. It's going to be physical neglect of a child or their environment that they live in. So this would be those really dirty, unsafe homes, physical neglect of the child, so poor hygiene for the child to the point where it's causing, say, children to get rashes and sores and things like that. So untreated, say, head lice that then escalates to the point where the child has open wounds, things like that. Lack of supervision. That's pretty self-explanatory. So, I do want to say that here in Arizona, we don't have a minimum age law. So there's no Kids can be left home alone if they're 11 and older. If they're under 11, they can't be left home alone. That doesn't exist here. Really, it's about, is the child in danger when they're left alone? What process did a family set up ahead of time? What are the rules the child knows to follow? Do they know not to answer the door? Do they know not to use a stove? Do they have a safety number that they can call if they need help? Is there a neighbor on alert if children are coming home after school for an hour and a half on their own? So what kind of safety plan do parents put in place for their kids if they're going to leave them unsupervised? So then we want to see, if we're going to accuse a person of lack of supervision, what happened? What was the result of that? How did the child come to any type of harm or injury due to that lack of supervision? Domestic violence in the presence of children is a big one. That is reportable under the law. If you are a mandated reporter and you know that's going on in a home where children reside or live, and it's serious and it's impacting the child, then that's something that you should be reporting under this statute. Medical neglect, that's not things like immunizations. People have that choice to make for their kiddos. It's things like if a child were diabetic and insulin dependent, is the parent neglecting to get that medical care for them? Are they kind of hit or miss about it? Do they sometimes check their sugar levels and sometimes not? Do they sometimes make insulin available to them? Are they making an 8 or 10-year-old child responsible for monitoring their own blood sugar level and giving themselves insulin, or are they overseeing that? So those things could be considered medical neglect. Dental issues would have to be really severe. So rotten teeth in somebody's mouth, if it's not causing them any other type of sickness or injury or harm, then that's probably not going to be considered medical neglect. If those teeth have become infected and now that's making the child sick and it's affecting them where they're not eating, they're not able to do other things, that could be escalated to the point where it might be considered a medical neglect. And substance abuse by caregivers is huge. In this area, I always want people to understand, if you call in a report to the hotline and say, I have a child and I know that the mom uses methamphetamine. Sure, that's illegal, that's not okay, but what they're going to need to know is, how is that use impacting the child? Is the parent impaired to the point where they're not providing supervision? Are they impaired to the point where they're not ensuring that the child eats and the child's too young to fix their own food or access their own food? Those types of things. So you need to have some specifics around how that substance abuse is impacting the child. And likewise, that goes for legal substances. So even if a parent is taking prescribed medication exactly as it's prescribed on the bottle, but it's causing them to sleep 20 hours a day, and they've got young children in their care who aren't getting adequate food, who aren't getting adequate supervision, who are harming themselves because they're trying to cook and burning things, who are going outside at young ages and possibly going out in the street when they shouldn't be out there. Those are the things that you're going to need to know around that substance abuse by the caregiver and really identify how it's putting that child in danger. Signs that you might see with neglect are poor growth or hygiene, lack of clothing or supplies to meet their physical needs, clothes that don't fit well or are inappropriate for the weather. And again, in that area, it's not enough to say, well, it's freezing outside, it's January in Prescott, and this kiddo's outside wearing flip-flops and a t-shirt. Well, what else do you see? Is the child telling you that they're freezing and cold? Are they crying because they're freezing and cold? Are their fingers or feet turning blue or purple or red because of this exposure? So you need to have those types of details if you are going to make a report. Something else you might see is kids who take food without permission or hiding food, hoarding food. When I taught school, I taught special education to kids with behavior and language disorders. And so we had kids that had food hoarding issues that certainly were not in a neglectful home. And so it could be behavioral health as well. But again, these are just signs that you can watch for. They could be indicators. Untreated illness or physical injury. Do you see something going on with a child and it's not getting addressed or not getting cared for? I always want to say caution, be careful. We want to make sure that people understand that poverty and having limited resources is not neglect. If a family can only afford to buy hot dogs and top ramen and dry cereal, but they're giving their children that food to put in their stomach every day, a few times a day, that's not neglect. They're doing the best that they can do. And lifestyle standards are not neglect as well. What I might consider a dirty home, or you might consider a dirty home, is very different than an unsafe home. And so that's really where we want to draw that line. We're not imposing our own standards on people here. We want to really be able to identify, how is this putting a child in danger? And then we have to differentiate between better care and necessary care. Parenting children is a constitutional right. And so all of us who are parents and have children in our lives, we wouldn't want someone to come in and tell us how to raise our kids. What are the best choices as far as their hygiene? What are the best choices as far as their nutrition? So again, just being aware of our own personal biases, and when we're trying to look at and assess these situations, making sure that's not the standards we're imposing on these people, that we're really looking at the well-being and health of the child only when we assess these situations. And that's when you ask yourself that question: does the lack of care seriously endanger this child and their physical health? And that's really what's going to lead you down that path to know if you have a situation that you need to make a report on. So the statute that talks about being a mandated reporter is ARS 133620. And here in Arizona, it's a very broad statute. So what it says is anybody who reasonably believes that a minor is or has been the victim of physical injury, abuse, or neglect inflicted on that minor by other than accidental means should immediately report or cause a report to be made to a police officer and to the Department of Child Safety. So under the law, you only have to report to one agency or the other, but there's reasons why it would be really important to report to both. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then if the child lives on the reservation, if the family is part of a tribe, then there's tribal authorities that you would report to rather than the state authorities or local town or city authorities. There's an exemption in this statute, which is specific to clergy and the confessional process. So if a perpetrator talks to their pastor or their priest and confides in them in an identified confessional situation that this is something I'm doing, that person is not a mandated reporter. That relieves them of that responsibility. But if that information comes to that same pastor or priest from a third person, so someone else in their congregation has learned about the situation, talks to them, they at that point don't get to turn around and say, well, I'm going to counsel this person, I'm going to talk to them, and then consider that a confessional situation. If the situation comes to them third party, they're mandated reporters, and they need to make the report to the hotline just as any other mandated reporter would. Under that statute that we just talked about, it says is or has been. So I want to identify that a little bit. So is the abuse currently going on? That's what we're talking about, is currently happening now. If a child comes to you and says, I spent the whole month of June in Phoenix with my dad, and one night he got really mad at me and he slapped me, and I had a couple bruises on my face for a few days, but it's now August. You could make that report. It may not get taken as a report, because at this point, how do they substantiate that? How do they move forward and say, yes, this happened? That's where the physical abuse piece is kind of hard, or neglect. If it's previous and it happened a while ago, there's very limited ways that our system can address that at this point after the fact. But sexual abuse is different. So the laws around that are very different. It talks about if a child is under the age of 16 and sexual abuse happened to them at any time, there is no statute of limitations. We can go back and hold somebody accountable years later. So if a child, say, was molested between the ages of 6 and 10, and they didn't tell anybody until they were 14, which is very common. Many kids have a delayed report because they need to wait till they feel safe. Sometimes they don't feel comfortable talking about it when that person still has access to them or they're in their life. Or sometimes they just need to feel older and more confident in their own ability to protect themselves till they will finally report. Anytime a person talks to you about that happening to a child, you're a mandated reporter. You shouldn't think about when did it happen, how old were they. You just need to call and make that report. The law does have a statute of limitations. If something happens to a child at the ages of 16 or 17, there's a 7-year statute of limitations. The other piece of that is once a person turns 18, it is their own responsibility or choice to report. So if you're a high school teacher and you have a senior in your class that turns 18 6 months before they graduate, you technically have an adult in your classroom. I know my kids didn't turn 18 and all of a sudden become adults, but at that point, it's their choice to make that report. You can't really report that for them. The clause in the law there is if the perpetrator was a parent, step parent, or guardian, there's other charges that they're going to have under a couple different laws. So that's why there's really no statute of limitations. And then there's the exception for teachers or clergy because those are professions that have ongoing access to additional children. So you want to make sure that if it comes to light that they had been doing something, that they can be held accountable for any person that they had harmed throughout their career, not just people going back 7 years. Duty to report is a personal responsibility. If your agency's policy is that you need to report to, say, your supervisor, your principal, your school nurse, your pastor, something like that, under this statute, that does not alleviate you from your own personal responsibility to report. So when I teach this training, I always tell people, you should always follow your work's policies and follow the law also. Call in a report yourself, tell your supervisor about it as well. Here at the Advocacy Center, I have direct staff that work for me. We're mandated reporters. Sometimes they'll come in and we'll call on speakerphone and they want to make the report together for whatever reason. They might feel more comfortable if I'm there helping them make that report, or they'll make the report and then they'll let me know as well. I mean, I do like to know when these reports are made out of our center. We work very closely with Department of Child Safety and law enforcement. And so if we're generating a report or work for them, I like to know about that. But each of my employees know that it is their personal responsibility to make that report themselves. The other thing that I want to make sure that people understand is under our statute, if your profession dictates that you are a mandated reporter, then you are a mandated reporter 24/7. So still in your off time, on your weekends, with your family, holidays, you are still a mandated reporter. You don't get to take that hat off when you go home at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock at the end of your day. You are a mandated reporter wherever you are. When you make a report to either DCS or to law enforcement, it's a good idea to get their report number. So you have that. You can do some follow-up if you want to know what's happening a few days later, or say you've made the report and then you get additional information about what you reported. You want to have that report number so you can call back in, reference that, and say, but I also learned this new information to support that, or maybe a better explanation about why it happened, whatever the information is. Can you be punished for not reporting? Under the law, you can. There's either a misdemeanor charge or there's a felony charge. And those consequences are going to come into play if a child comes to harm. And through the process of that investigation, it's determined that they were with other mandated reporters while that abuse or neglect was happening. Those mandated reporters were aware of the abuse or neglect, but they failed to report. And now it's resulted in harm and sometimes, unfortunately, even death of children. And that's where these charges may come into play. It's rare, but I have seen that happen in our state. A long time ago, there was a child that was in a school district somewhere else in our state and ended up dying at the hands of his father. And it came to light throughout the criminal investigation that there were some people in that child's life that were mandated reporters that had known that was going on and had failed to make a report at several different points throughout that child's life when they should have made a report. And they ended up getting charged under the statute. There's immunity for you if you're a reporter. So if somebody, whether that's because you tell them, hey, I'm a mandated reporter, these are my concerns, I'm going to need to make a report about your family, or if you report to police, criminal records are public, so they could maybe get your name that way. DCS should never be revealing their source to a family when they go out and talk to them. But whether they know it was you or suspect it was you, they cannot come back and sue you for civil or criminal issues. They can't sue you for slander, defamation of character, any of those types of things. unless the person who's reporting it is also the person that committed that abuse. So if you're doing it kind of to CYA, to cover yourself, and that comes to light, then you could not only get in trouble for the abuse that you caused, but you could also get charged with false reporting. Or if you don't make the report in good faith, if it's done with malice. And that happens a lot in shared custody cases, divorce cases, where parents are calling in on each other. So if I have a custody hearing tomorrow and I'm trying to get full custody and I don't want my spouse to have custody, and today a case opens up with Department of Child Safety because there's suspicion that my spouse has maybe been abusing our kids. That's not the way our system is designed to be used. And I really stress to people, if I've ever known that to happen throughout my career, that's so dangerous and so harmful to children, unless we really have a concern something's going on. What do you need to know when you make a report? You need to know the age, gender of the child, family information, and estimating any of that is fine. Phone numbers and address or directions to the child's home. If you don't know the address, that's okay too. I've had to make a report before. I was in a store parking lot and I saw a person like literally physically punching their children. We all try to stay out of those situations in hopes that maybe it's just a family situation if somebody's yelling at their child in a store or parking lot. I don't usually interfere, but when I saw this, I could tell that it was very serious and this child was getting injured in front of my eyes. And all I had was the license plate number. I called in a report, they left the parking lot, and that's what I gave to law enforcement when I called in the report, and that was how they were able to locate the family. So any information you have, the more the better. But they want to know, what's the current condition of the child right now? What are you seeing right now? That's going to help them decide how fast they need to respond, how soon somebody needs to get out there to see that child. And dates of birth, social security numbers, anything like that is always the more the better, because they can then check their systems. And so it's very helpful for law enforcement or Department of Child Safety if this family has some historical involvement with them, to know that before they go out, so that those conversations when they're out there are more meaningful and have more substance. It's much easier to say, I know this has been an ongoing problem for you. This is the third call we've received in the last 2 years. You need to let us give you services. We need to be able to help alleviate this and make sure this doesn't happen again. That's a different conversation than if it's the first time something's happened. So if a child talks to you or discloses to you, stop, do not conduct an interview, and do not notify parents. Policies and procedures and laws that govern the Department of Child Safety give them timeframes, and they must notify parents within so many hours of receiving a report or of contacting those people's children. So that is not your job as a mandated reporter. In fact, you are not supposed to do that. DCS times vary anywhere from 2 hours to 7 days. And so if you make a report and then that child goes home and DCS has not made contact yet, you could be putting that child in a dangerous or vulnerable situation where now their parents could retaliate against them or punish them, or have some pretty harsh conversations with them around why they're talking about things that happen in the family that they shouldn't be talking about with other people. We don't want to interview kids because there's a couple reasons. Number one, every time a person talks about a trauma, it brings that trauma back up and it causes more internal hurt over what's happening. So if any of you can think back to a time that something traumatic happened to you, a death in your family, perhaps a car accident you were in, if you think about that, when you tell that story to another person, it brings those emotions back up. You have those same feelings. We don't want to put kids through that multiple times. We also don't want to compromise the evidence. If this does come in and turn out to be a criminal case, we want to make sure that the children are only having to tell their story one time and that they can't be discredited. So if necessary, if you need to ask more questions, you need to know what happened, when did it happen, or approximately where did it happen, and who did it. You know, if a child says to you, I was home last night, my uncle came in my bedroom and took his clothes off and tried to climb in bed with me and touch me. You know who, when, where, and what happened. You don't need to ask any more questions. You can make a report based off of that. How do you make a report in an emergency situation? You're going to call law enforcement. Again, like I said, DCS's shortest response time is 2 hours. And so if you have a child with you in this moment and they're afraid to go home, afraid to be with their caregiver, law enforcement's the call you need to make. They can respond and come out immediately. Otherwise, you may want to call the Department of Child Safety. Each agency does something a little bit different. Law enforcement's investigating that single act, that single crime that you called in. Department of Child Safety is doing a global family assessment. They're going to look at all areas in that home, and they're going to talk to all the kids that live there, all the children that may live there part-time if there's shared custody issues, and then all the adults and caregivers in that home. And there's going to be background checks and home checks and all those other things. Non-emergency situations, there's an online reporting website to DCS where you can make that report, or again, you could call in the report that way. Time is important, particularly in regards to any type of sexual abuse that you're reporting. We can collect DNA evidence up to 120 hours after a report is made. So if you know that it's happened, say yesterday or the day before, you need to make the call immediately so we can get that medical exam, take the swabs, collect that evidence while it's still there. And that's going to support what that child is telling us. Because many times it just comes down to the word of the person who committed the crime against the child. And the more supporting evidence we can get to support what the child is telling us, the better. So I just want to briefly touch on what an advocacy center is. And that's hopefully where these children are going to get taken after a report is made. That's a center I run here in Prescott Valley, and we're a project, as I said, of Prevent Child Abuse Arizona. We have more than 20 advocacy centers in our state. Some are dedicated for adults, some are dedicated only for children, and then many, like mine, are what's called a family advocacy center. So we help facilitate the investigation of interpersonal crimes for all ages. So sexual abuse, domestic violence, child abuse. And we aid in that evidence collection. All those medical exams take place in an advocacy center building. All the people who need to help this family come here. So they're not having to jump from a hospital to a police station, to an advocate's office, to a therapist office. They're getting everybody coming here to work for them as a team. One of the main messages I want to get across is you, me, communities, businesses, families, we can all prevent child abuse. It is largely preventable. And how do we do that? We want to talk about things like making parents feel valued and supported, particularly in these times right now with COVID. To listen and express empathy, not to make people feel ostracized or embarrassed that this is going on in their home and how dare that happen. It would never go on in my home. We want to be empathetic to those stresses and those things going on with them. Respond to parents who are in crisis or who seem stressed. Connect families with resources. If you're seeing a child come to you every day and they are constantly hungry, and you're making sure they eat breakfast, but you're worried about them on the weekends and you're worried that the family isn't able to provide food, have that conversation first. Talk to that family. Your kiddo's coming to school and they're hungry all the time. I have some resources that can help you. I want to talk to you about that. I want to be able to give you some information. Be mindful of how vulnerable people are and how our little guys are the ones that bear that brunt when parents are stressed and feel anxious and have all of these outside pressures in these times right now of isolation, people kind of being afraid to be around each other. It's more critical now than ever to take care of people, connecting families with resources, and help kids develop social and emotional skills. Help them to get to a place where they're okay talking to other people about what's happening and talking to you early. So maybe that is a place where you might want to step in and, as I talked about in the very beginning, support before you have to report. And even in situations, if you're a mandated reporter where you need to make a report based on what we talked about, there's still ways to support families through that as well. Yes, I'm a mandated reporter, I need to make a report, but I'm also here to support you and your family. This is a great resource. This is particular to the time of the pandemic, COVID-19, and this is about supporting child and family well-being during this time. So I urge all of you to go on to pcaaz.org/support and look at this resource guide, and it will give some great tips on how we can help and support the families in our communities and the people that are most vulnerable. Thank you so much for listening today and participating in this training. I hope this was helpful. And again, let's all take care of each other. Thank you so much.